And I welcome all of you to today's training. My name is Courtney Winkler. I am the Training and Outreach Coordinator at the Delaware Coalition Against Domestic Violence. And I am very happy to be here with you to talk about the connection between domestic violence and housing. We have just a couple housekeeping things to go over before we really jump into our content today. So please keep your mic muted unless you are speaking. It just makes life a lot easier for everyone who's trying to listen. Um, I will pause for questions throughout the session and invite folks to unmute if they would like to share. Or you can share in the chat. So if you have anything to share, please feel free to do that in the chat. Erin and Jessica are also monitoring the chat. So one of us will be able to get back to you. But like I said, we will have breaks for questions in between. And we are recording today's session. And so we will be sharing the recording and the materials to everyone who's registered. It'll also be on the Housing Alliance YouTube, and we'll make sure that everybody gets those materials. We'll also post some of them on the DCADV website. So we want to make sure that everyone has access to everything from the training and make sure that it is most helpful. So jumping in, looking at why are we here? Why are we in this session today? So as many of you know, survivors and their families face tremendous barriers when trying to access and maintain safe and affordable housing. We know that survivors are often evicted because of the violence and the trauma that they experience. So, we are going to talk about some protections, some state and federal protections, housing protections shortly. But we also know that. Domestic violence is the leading cause of homelessness for women and children in the US. And so we know that with all of these barriers that have been put up and all of the personal and systemic barriers that exist, we know that this is a huge issue in our communities. And when we look at survivors with children, we know that they are doing whatever they can to prioritize their children and their families. And sometimes that means going back to their abuser because their children will have a roof over their heads and more of their needs met. And so it really creates another type of housing crisis for people. And this quote from a survivor really sums up the issue well. And they say, I may have found the courage to finally leave my abuser, but becoming homeless as a result of that has caused me to lose my dignity. It's trauma on top of trauma that is unrelenting. For survivors of domestic violence, having stable, affordable housing is not about just being displaced. It's a safety issue of life or death. And when people ask me, what it's like to be homeless, I answer, it's being completely homesick for a home that doesn't exist. And so I found this quote so powerful. And I think it is a really good reminder for us as we go through today and talk about the challenges and barriers, but also the resources and supports and protections that are out there for people. It really helps us that in whatever role that we're in, that we can remember this quote to remind us of the issue at hand. So during our session today, we are going to do just a brief overview of the dynamics and prevalence of domestic violence. We will look at some of the federal and state housing protections available for survivors. We will explore some tools and safety planning strategies. And finally, we will talk about how to connect survivors to resources in the community. I'm very excited that Deidre Harper and Sue Frost from Child Inc.'s Rapid Rehousing program are on with us today, so you may be hearing them pipe in throughout. So I'm very glad to have all of your support here today. So we are going to start off just looking at the dynamics of domestic violence. So we all know that domestic violence is a major social and health problem across the country and in our world at large. But how big of a problem is it? The data from the CDC shows us that in a national survey that almost 1 in 2 women and more than 2 in 5 men have reported experiencing contact sexual violence, physical violence, and or stalking victimization by an intimate partner at some point in their lifetime. So this means that you've got friends, family, neighbors, coworkers, clients who are affected by this issue, perhaps even yourself. And there are times where we may not even know it. It may not even come to our attention, but knowing that it is highly probable and possible that people that we're working with are affected by intimate partner domestic violence. We also know that some groups are at a higher risk of experiencing domestic violence. We know that structural inequalities like gender inequality, misogyny, transphobia, racism, and poverty make women, women with low incomes, women of color, people with disabilities, and LGBTQ people some of the likeliest groups to experience DV and trauma on a disproportionate level. And when we look at housing and homelessness in 2023, approximately 10.4% of all emergency shelter, transitional housing, and safe haven beds in homeless service systems were targeted to survivors of domestic violence and their families. And so, thinking about homelessness in general, we know that so many people who are experiencing domestic violence and trauma are within that housing need. And so when we talk about domestic or intimate partner violence, it's really categorized by this pattern of actions that an individual uses to intentionally control or dominate their partner. And so this graphic here, our power and control wheel, really shows us that power and control is at the core of violent relationships. And so this wheel shows us how violence or the threat of violence, the threat to a victim's physical or sexual safety, is a tactic that surrounds all others and really holds that power together. And then you'll see the spokes of the wheel describe some of the other tactics that are used by abusers to maintain control over their partner, like isolating them from their support systems, blaming them for the abuse that is happening, or withholding money or resources. And while we know that that violence, that physical or sexual violence, may not happen often, it happens enough, or the threat of it is there enough to instill that fear in their partner. Because we know that this coercive control that is used by the abuser to instill fear and compliance in their partner, because if there's no fear, then they have no control. And so, in a housing context, that might look like having repeated calls to the police from the victim or the person who's causing the harm. Keeping the victim off of a lease so they have no power or control in their housing matters. Or the abuser making unwanted or unannounced visits to the home, even when they've been asked to stay away, have moved out. Maybe there's a protection order in place, but they're still showing up and inserting themselves into that victim's life. And so, one of the things to remember when working with people who have been affected by domestic violence is that it's all about context. That it may appear on the outside that people are doing really counterproductive things, that they are using strategies or tools or doing things that seem harmful or don't make sense, like when they go back to their abusive partner or when they stay with a partner, even though violence is continually happening. It may not make sense to us on the outside, but in reality, they may have learned that that's the safest thing for them to do at this point. It's the safest strategy to help them survive and to keep them and their family safe. So it really is all about context. And until we're in that experience, we may not have any idea what that perspective is. And so oftentimes people will say, well, if you just separate from them, then the abuse will stop and it'll go away. But unfortunately, we know that that power and control is at the center of all these dynamics, even when the relationship ends. And so as that abuser loses control, if or when their partner attempts to separate from them, they will continue to maintain or effort, or they will maintain efforts to regain that power. And those efforts can actually escalate after separation. Because in an attempt to get that power and control back we start to see an unrelenting focus on the survivor. The survivor may not engage with the abuser and even go out of their way to avoid them if they're changing the routines, if they are changing their work schedule, if they move. All of these things, they go out of their way to avoid them at all costs. But there's this obsessive and overwhelming focus on the survivor. Where are they? What are they doing? Are they seeing somebody else? Where are they living? Do they still want to be with me? And they may do everything in their power to control from afar. So, flooding the victim with phone calls or text messages, working through their shared network of friends or family members to gain information, because every little bit of information helps, or using children as tools of control and manipulation. We also know that they may use systems as a tactic as well. Um, Similar to what we talked about, that the survivor may or the abuser may be using the survivor's emotions against them, manipulating custody and visitation decisions, exhausting the survivor's legal resources, creating conflicts of interest when they're trying to seek services, especially when we look at legal services or housing resources. They're really putting a wedge between them. And even though the survivor has left or is attempting to leave, we know that even if they may seem like they've got it back together, where they've got all the resources and all the supports that they need, we still know that safety, health, well-being, they are all affected. And we know that people are not free by any means. And so that struggle does continue to be there. All right. Have any questions come into the chat? No?
No, not yet.
All righty. So in this section, we'll move into talking about some housing protections. And so with all that we've covered so far, talking about the impacts and dynamics of domestic violence, we can see why we need to have protections in place for survivors. So let's take a look at some of the existing options that are out there. And so we have the Federal Fair Housing Act, the FHA, and this protects domestic violence survivors from discrimination in housing situations, regardless of whether the housing is supported financially by the government. And this includes, excuse me, the right to be free from discrimination when seeking housing, to buy or rent, just for being a survivor, to be protected from eviction, again, just for being a survivor, just on that basis, to be treated the same as other tenants or occupants by a housing provider, and to request reasonable accommodations to ensure that everyone has equal opportunity to use and enjoy housing as they see fit. We also have the Americans with Disabilities Act, which protects survivors with a disability, including those disabilities that have happened as a result of domestic or sexual violence. We know that women with disabilities disproportionately experience domestic violence as a vulnerable population. So the ADA is one of the things that is really essential to be aware of when supporting survivors, and their protection from discrimination. And additionally, Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 requires survivors with disabilities to have reasonable accommodations made for them. So, for example, if they need a guide dog to remain with a visually impaired survivor, they need to be able to have access to that. Whatever that they need to be able to safely and equally enjoy their housing accommodations. Section 504 also protects people from discrimination in housing practices. For example, housing providers cannot or may not require persons with disabilities to live only on certain floors, or in one section of housing, making those decisions for them about where it's best to live, or we're going to put all of the people with special needs all in one place. They may also not refuse to make repairs. Those are they may say, well, this person uses a wheelchair, and so there's going to be even more wear and tear on their carpet or their entranceway or within their within their abode. And so they can't just say, well, we're not going to do that because studies have shown that the amount of wear and tear with somebody with disabilities and somebody without disabilities is pretty equal. They may also not limit or deny somebody with a disability access to recreational or other public or common use facilities, parking privileges, janitorial services, or any services that are made available to other residents without disabilities. And so, again, we need to, when looking at criteria for deciding who to rent to and who to offer housing access, it's imperative that we use the same objective criteria that's applied to people without disabilities and people with disabilities. Now, the big one that we're going to focus a lot on today is the Violence Against Women Act, or VAWA. And so VAWA provides housing protections for survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, dating violence, and or stalking who are applying for or living in federally assisted housing. And so this law applies to more than just women, so its name is kind of a misnomer, but the law applies to survivors regardless of their sex, their gender identity, sexual orientation, disability, or age. And so VAWA protections do not apply to market rate rental housing unless there is a voucher or other federal subsidy. And so this is something that you all may deal with more than other housing providers. And so the ultimate goal of VAWA protections are to help keep survivors safe and reduce their likelihood of experiencing homelessness. So it's really putting this supportive network and structure in place so they can access and keep their housing situation. On this very tiny chart here, well, actually, it's not as small as I thought. But in terms of who has obligations under VAWA, they are folks who we call covered housing providers. And so they are entities or housing providers that receive some kind of subsidy or assistance from HUD, such that folks are getting rental assistance. So typical entities are public housing authorities, but we also know that there are owners and landlords in multifamily contexts that are getting housing assistance or housing subsidies through SNAP, through Homeless Assistance Program, through the COC, through other subgrantees. So this is a long list here of those different programs. And within the most recent reauthorization of VAWA in 2022, this also includes this catch-all provision to include all the other applicable programs. Because like with anything, if we start listing out every single nuance of things, sometimes it can get pretty complicated. And so as this catch-all provision, we can see that it's safe to assume that if a client or a consumer is receiving some kind of rental assistance from the federal government, then more likely than not, the Violence Against Women Act and its protections will apply to them. And so under VAWA, there are a number of rights that people do have. And so housing providers must be providing information to their tenants on their rights under the Violence Against Women Act. So they have to have this notice of their rights. And this is really helpful to do proactively as well. It's really great for people to know what's out there because, again, with the prevalence data that we see with so many people who are affected by domestic violence, either in their past or in the present, we know that it's good for people to know, and they may not disclose right away. They may not be telling people what's going on. They may not want to share it with people. It's not something that is great to talk about. People may be afraid of losing their housing, of losing their children, of losing their job. And so they may keep this all to themselves because they don't know what's out there for them. And so if we can provide this information to people up front, even if, we're not going to cherry pick and say, well, this person looks like they could be affected and this person doesn't. If we're providing that universally, that way people can be proactive if they end up needing those protections. And just like we talked about with the ADA, there is a non-discrimination right as well. Survivors cannot be denied access to services, they cannot be evicted or have their assistance terminated simply because of the violence against them. Survivors can insist that abusers are removed from their lease and their housing. So, a public housing authority or landlord may also bifurcate or split a lease to evict abusers while allowing the victim to stay. And so, if the individual who is evicted is the tenant who is eligible to receive the housing assistance, the landlord must provide the remaining tenant at least 90 days or until the lease expires, must give them that notice in order to move or establish their own eligibility for another program. And so within that eviction, the landlord has to follow all of the federal, state, local laws in eviction. Um, and in the Housing Choice Voucher Program, if a family breakup results because of the violence, they must ensure that the victim retains assistance. And so this is a really helpful thing to do when, we have people who are afraid to call the police if they're afraid that they're going to get kicked out of their housing because of the violence that's been inflicted against them, that there are protections to help keep them in a place where they feel safe. Because we know if people lose access to supportive housing, that could mean homelessness or having to stay in that unsafe situation. So, survivors with housing choice vouchers can move with continued assistance. The portability restrictions do not apply if the move is related to the violence of some kind. And they can also seek an emergency transfer to another unit in the same location or another location, or they can remain right where they are, even if the crime has been committed there that is directly related to the violence. Um, and we're going to talk a little bit more about emergency transfers in just a bit. But this is a time where it's really important that we center their survivor. Um, and prioritize their needs because they know what's safe for them. They know where they're going to be able to live safely. They know their abuser better than anyone else. And so they're going to be the one who can make those decisions about their safety. Survivors also have a right to strict confidentiality of information regarding their status as a survivor. And extensive documentation is not required. So survivors can self certify as to the domestic violence that they've experienced. So a police report or other third party report is not needed. And who chooses that documentation? The survivor does. And so housing providers must accept whatever documentation that the survivor provides. And so there's a couple different options here for documentation. So the housing provider is free to take their tenant at their word or can ask the tenant to provide proof of the violence. Um, and there are times where there may be confusing or conflicting details. So it may be that, both parties, there's some dual aggression there. The survivor and the abuser may disagree on who the quote unquote real victim is. Maybe the survivor is using self defense to protect themselves. So there may be times where things do get a little muddy. And so there may be additional documentation that they ask for backup. So any request by a housing authority, a landlord, a property owner must come in writing. And so they have to notify the person that they are looking for additional documentation. And the tenant has 14 business days from receiving the request to provide that proof. And if they need more time, the housing provider is free to grant that extension if they do need more time. However, housing providers cannot engage in their own additional fact finding to find if somebody is really a victim. We know that this can really start breaching and violating confidentiality guidelines. And while it may be fun to pretend to be a detective and think you can dig up things, it's really not appropriate. So conducting interviews with neighbors, with employers, following people around, those kinds of things we're going to steer away from. We're going to stay on the up and up and work with the survivor to find that information. And so that self certification is designed to be low barrier and not re traumatizing. So we don't want people to have to call the police to get a police report. We don't want them to have to write up a whole, novel about what has happened to them. We don't want to have multiple interviews with friends and family and witnesses. So this HUD form 5382 is one of the easiest means and low barrier means of providing that documentation. It's a one pager. There's another page that has instructions on it. It's available in 15 different languages, and it collects just basic information about the situation. It looks at who's involved, where do they live, who's causing the harm, and what happened. And so in some cases, there might be times where the landlord has observed the abuse and documented it themselves. Maybe they've seen somebody show up with a black eye. Maybe they have been in the area when they have overheard things going on, or the person has directly told them what's going on. So they may have their own documentation there as well. But again, this form is very simple. And again, it's designed to be low barrier and not have to make people jump through a ton of hoops to prove their victimization. Some other types of documentation that might be helpful could include, at the discretion of the survivor, a police, court, or administrative record, a statement from a third party, like a victim service provider, maybe a medical professional, a mental health professional, or an attorney. Or they may have other kind of statements or evidence, like emails, text messages, voicemails, social media postings. We know that people who are causing harm there can be a gigantic umbrella under which they're doing these things. And so there's a variety of things that are out there that people can use. Any third party documentation, so if you're getting a victim service provider or a police record or your therapist to provide that documentation, it must be signed by both that third party and the survivor under penalty of perjury. So those are things just to keep in mind as well. But again, the bar is very low in terms of what people actually need to prove. And finally, victims and survivors cannot be coerced, intimidated, threatened, or retaliated against by HUD subsidized housing providers for seeking or exercising their VAWA protections. These protections are there for a reason, and folks should be able to comfortably rely on them when it's necessary without fear of retaliation, without fear that they're not going to be able to rent anywhere, that they're going to be in danger. For staying in their same unit because of what has happened. So they are protected in that way as well. We talked a little bit about emergency transfers, and this is another core VAWA housing protection. So it's a way to ensure that people who are in a covered housing program and have experienced domestic violence can get connected to safe housing after their subsidy has begun. And so emergency transfers are available when the occupant requests the transfer and either of the following is true. So they either believe that there is a threat of imminent harm from further violence if they stay in that unit. So maybe they have kicked out their abusive partner and they're afraid that they're going to come back. Or maybe they're on the same lease and that person has a right to come back. Maybe that person has made threats to them that they're going to harm them, their children, their pets, they're going to do something. So if they feel like there is an imminent harm if they stay where they are, then that may be eligible for an emergency transfer. Or the other transfer opportunity is if the victim is or if the tenant is a victim of sexual assault And if the sexual assault occurred on those premises, so if they're in an apartment and it occurred at their apartment within the preceding 90 days, 90 calendar days, they may be able to request an emergency transfer, because nobody wants to stay in well, I would assume that nobody would want to stay in the same place where harm and violence has befallen them. However, remember that safe unit is what the occupant believes to be safe. And so again, so I may think, well, if I was assaulted in my apartment, I don't want to go back there. I want to go somewhere else. I need to get out of here. I don't want to be in this space anymore. But others may say, well, you know what? I'm okay staying here. I will do things to protect myself. I will have a security system. People know what happened. There's going to be protections put into place. And both of those arguments are completely fine. So again, those emergency transfers are designed to get people into safe units. And so wherever that person thinks it's safe, even if the housing provider has a different opinion, people have a right to articulate what they think is safe, and that preference should be honored wherever possible. And for folks who are in the Section 8 housing choice voucher, who are in a unit that is subsidized by the voucher program, the survivor must be able to move with continued assistance to a new unit with that subsidy continuing. There are times where maybe an emergency transfer isn't able to be carried out. There are a couple things to do. We want to be able to problem solve some immediate housing solutions outside the scope of an emergency transfer. So if that's not possible, what is possible? What protections can be put into place there? If it is a case where the emergency transfer falls into one of those two buckets that we just talked about, and so the person feels that this is a violation of their rights, the provider should be able to assist with a fair housing complaint or to advocate with or with the housing provider. So whether it's a housing provider, if a victim service provider, somebody can assist that person with that complaint. It's also helpful to refer people to legal services when necessary, or to connect them to other services that can help them establish safe housing, or connect them with service providers who can help them meet other needs. And we are going to get into more about resources and referrals in just a bit. And so right now I'm going to turn things over to Jessica and Erin. So we know that Delaware's COC has a policy on emergency transfer plans, which you can find in pages 8 to 10 of the policies. If you want to scan the QR code and follow along, or visit the Housing Alliance website to read more, you are welcome to do so. But I'm going to stop sharing and turn it over to Erin to take us through that plan.
All right. So we are going to go through some of the requirements that Delaware has in terms of emergency transfer policies, and what actually specifically is covered for COC and ESG providers. Our policy does, the way it's written, does apply to all other federal homeless assistance and housing assistance projects, but this is going to focus primarily on our ESG and COC providers. I'm going to review some of similar information that Courtney's already gone over, but again, it's going to be more tailored to what is applicable to you guys. So just a little bit of background overview. So why do we talk about VAWA and domestic violence and homeless services? Because there's a really big overlap. 44% of cities identify DV as the primary cause of homelessness across the country. More than 90% of women experiencing homelessness have experienced severe physical or sexual abuse, and 30% or 38% of all DV survivors experience homelessness. So those are not small percentages by any means. So there is a lot of overlap between the systems. So these housing protections are meant to foster trust, especially for marginalized populations experiencing homelessness that also have acute safety needs due to victimization. And for us, the project types that are considered covered housing programs, in which these requirements adhere to, are rapid rehousing, transitional housing, joint transitional rapid rehousing, permanent supportive housing, homeless prevention, and ESG rapid rehousing. So we're required to have VAWA compliant emergency transfer policy at the COC level that covers all COC and ESG providers to help ensure the safety of participants who are facing victimization. Those are located in our policies, which are available on our webpage and in our public Google Drive folder. And I think, as Courtney mentioned, it starts on page 8. So under this policy, all projects that receive federal homeless assistance have to say that they follow all their follow requirements and actually do so. They need to prioritize the safety of the participants in their programs that are facing victimization. And they have to have a written policy and procedure in place to implement emergency transfers when they're needed. So emergency transfer policies or emergency transfer plans should generally be available for review upon request, and where it makes sense, publicly available for people who are potentially going to be staying in your programs. And as Courtney mentioned earlier, participants should be notified of their VAWA rights and the provider's emergency transfer policy when they're entering the program. It should be something that is reviewed with them at intake and that we recommend reviewing with them at intake. I'm not going to re-go over these definitions, but this is a HUD graphic from one of the resource trainings that I have at the end of these slides that I thought was helpful just in understanding kind of a simple version of who is actually covered and what constitutes a reason for emergency transfer that can be requested from a victim. So our emergency transfer policy has a couple different sections, and it reviews a lot of the overall requirements that Courtney went over, but specifically for how we apply them here in the COC. So first, as it's written now, and there will be opportunity to give feedback on the policy as we get later into the slides. But first, we do currently have it that participants should expressly request a transfer by notifying their case manager and submitting a written request for the transfer. You can use the form that Courtney. We have another person that we interact with regularly named Christy, and I was thinking about her earlier, so I apologize. But also self-certification is accepted. Case managers for covered housing projects are encouraged to assist the participants with the submission of the written request, especially if having like a paper trail or something like that is going to directly put the participant in danger of more victimization. But you guys are also required to provide reasonable accommodations in the application of the policy, especially for individuals with disabilities and those who have language barriers. For documentation, you guys have to document both the request and the outcome internally, and you have to notify the COC or ESG, whoever your direct funder is, when an emergency transfer is requested. We are required as a COC to report all of the outcomes of requested transfers to HUD annually, and all documentation must be kept on file for at least 3 years. In terms of timing and availability, when you guys receive an emergency transfer request, you want to move that person into a safe unit or identify a safe unit as quickly as possible. If a safe unit is not immediately available, that participant must receive first priority for openings in any of the covered projects within our system. And you will, when you review in the actual policy, there's a process in place to connect with centralized intake in that event, so that they can help with those. Internal transfers and external transfers, we're going to review those definitions on the next slide. But internal transfers are prioritized when it's safe. But external transfers are facilitated when necessary. And again, there's a process for centralized intake assistance in that case. So internal transfers are relocations from one unit to another where the participant is not going to be considered a new participant. So what that really means is that you're moving from one unit to another within the same project or within the same provider. And you don't have to transfer from one provider to another in order to get a new unit. Internal transfers, if they're available, should always be offered immediately, and external transfers can also be given at the same time. So they're not limited to one or the other. They can be searching for or looking for both at the same time, or both can be provided at the same time. And again, it's up to what the participant needs. For external transfers, this is when the provider or the participant would be considered moving to a new provider. So if we are moving a participant from, let's say, Ministry of Caring to the YWCA, that would be considered an external transfer because the transfer from one provider to the other would make that person a new participant and in order to be served in a new unit. And those should be offered again if internal units are not available with the provider. This is another HUD graphic, and if you look at any of their emergency transfer slides, don't tattle on me for stealing it from them, but I thought it provided a really good overview of the emergency transfer process and kind of the different pieces that move into that. So it takes you from project entry to their occupancy stay, when they transfer the request, when they have a safe unit identification. It also provides a really good outline of the difference between like an internal or an external transfer through to when a new unit is occupied or identified. I'm not going to read all of the information, but it is a really good graphic that you guys should save if you'd like. Again, in terms of documentation, this was another graphic that I thought was helpful in reviewing exactly what documentation is needed. And there are providers that can fill multiple roles. So if you are a COC recipient, you are also the covered housing provider. And so you will have to report on any emergency transfer requests again and the outcomes in your APR or your CAPR if you're an ESG provider. And you're also required to submit that to the COC. So that would be me or Jessica or Rachel. We have to report that to HUD as well. So there's a lot of tracking that goes into emergency transfer documentation. There's a couple additional requirements that are kind of related to the emergency transfer, but also just generally for programs that are serving victims broadly. Again, this leases, subleases, or occupancy agreements have to comply with that COC program interim rule. And what that does is it prevents the basis for eviction or restrictions on a lease due to victimization. Those agreements can specify that the protections only apply when the participant is receiving assistance from the project. And site-based projects have to allow participants to terminate without penalty if the participant qualifies for an emergency transfer. Things that are prohibited for denial or termination of assistance or eviction. So participants can't be denied admission or be evicted because they are a victim. Providers are required to ensure that the refusal of a transfer request is also not the basis for terminating a participant from assistance. So you can't just say, you requested a transfer, we can no longer serve you. You are required to continue serving that participant, and you are required to ensure that they are safe and that that transfer is implemented. Providers are also encouraged, when possible, to take on the moving costs related to emergency transfers. For COC providers, there's actually new eligible costs under several line items that help with that. So we can talk about that in more detail if you guys want to, around what that means for COC funded providers. For ESG providers, it's going to be a little bit of more of a challenge. I don't know if they intend to make those covered costs moving forward for ESG providers. I'm assuming that they will, and if we hear anything from HUD related to that, we will send that out to you guys. So confidentiality, emergency transfer policies and plans, again, have to incorporate strict confidentiality measures to make sure that the survivor's information is protected from their abuser. So our policy just states that providers will keep confidential any information about emergency transfer requests or outcomes unless the participant gives written permission to release that information, and it has to be on a time-limited basis. The disclosure of that information is required by law, or if the disclosure is required as evidence in an eviction proceeding or hearing regarding termination for the participant in the covered process or project. That link there will also take you to way more detailed information about your guys' responsibilities as providers to maintain confidentiality and information related to incidents of violence in your programs. Not in your programs, but for participants in your programs. And safety and security of participants. So the rates of victimization are really high among homeless populations, and many victims experience homelessness, either choose not to disclose or sometimes might not recognize the incidents of violence that they're facing. So you guys as the providers really have a significant incentive to make sure that safety planning is offered as part of your ongoing case management. And safety planning in general is an essential part of making sure that every participant, not just victims, have access to safe housing. And pending the actual transfer, we do also just encourage participants themselves to take all reasonable precautions to be safe. And those who are experiencing violence or have experienced violence are encouraged to contact all available resources for assistance with safety planning. In our actual policy, we do have a bunch of those resources listed out. And Courtney went over a bunch of those today. We do encourage you guys to incorporate those resources into your own policies or have maybe keep a copy of the slides or the number in your intake packets with that notification of rights. I always recommend maybe doing a notification of rights and resources. So that way it's just connected. So we are going to do an emergency transfer policy review. So annually we ask for community review and feedback of our governance documents during our membership drive, which happens every September. But if you're interested in reviewing and providing feedback on the policy, the emergency transfer policy specifically, prior to our review period, you should feel free to contact myself or Jessica, or just review the policy and submit your feedback whenever you have time to do so. But we are available to answer any questions or talk through any specific items if you want that from us. And again, all of our governance documents, which is where this policy is located, are available on our website, on our governance page, and in our Google Drive folder, which is publicly available for everybody. And just some additional guidance and resources that I think would be really helpful specifically for the ESG and COC providers. HUD earlier in the year did a 3-part training series on these requirements in particular. If you again view this one, you're going to see some of the same graphics and information. Again, don't tattle on me. And there's also some community conversations about VAWA and practice, which I think is really helpful for specific examples or common things that happen with providers providing the same assistance as you guys that might be helpful in helping you guys navigate how you approach that in your programs realistically. And the intention behind this series was to just increase your guys' knowledge and capacity to be able to implement these protections within your programs. And additionally, there's just some information here. So HUD has a emergency transfer like model policy model plan. And that is a really good start if you guys haven't incorporated this into your policies and procedures already and want to and have to. And then some of the federal guidance that actually puts forth these requirements, and Courtney went over those in quite a bit of detail already, but these are just some additional links that would help you if you're interested in reading the actual federal legislation and guidance on that. And that's it for me. I will be sending these slides out with the rest of the materials. So you guys will have access to those. And again, all of that will be publicly available on our website and in the Google Drive as well. I just wanted to open it up for any questions before I kick it back to Courtney. For anybody who has any specific questions about the COC's policy. I don't hear any, so I'm gonna give it back to you, Courtney.
All right, thank you. And if your brain is not working quickly and you have other questions, please feel free to put those in the chat. Or we can, we'll have some extra time later on to come back to questions as well. But thank you, Erin, for all of those, all of that information. And who doesn't want to read federal guidelines and federal legislation? It's just some light reading, but we are going to jump back into looking at just finishing up talking about some of the other housing protections. And here we are going to focus on Delaware specific laws. Delaware has additional protections for survivors that include things like early lease termination and eviction protections. And these laws also have their own documentation requirements. And state and local protections expand the protection to the private market or non-federally subsidized housing as well, which is really helpful. All right, so with early lease termination, Delaware allows early termination of leases with a 30-day written notice for someone who is the victim of domestic abuse, or sexual offenses, stalking, or if somebody has obtained or sought relief for any of those things from a court, police agency, or DV program or service. There's also additional eviction protections, prevent a landlord from raising the rent, decreasing access, or evicting a tenant simply because they are a victim of violence. And this program, which I think is incredibly useful, the Address Confidentiality Program, it runs out of the DOJ, and this is a really useful program that protects a participant's real address by providing a mail forwarding service and giving participants a legal substitute address in place of their physical address. So people who are within the Address Confidentiality Program are given a PO box as their legal mailing address, and that's really the only time that that's ever allowed. So on their driver's license, it would have a PO box. On any legal documents, it would have a PO box, and their mail gets routed through, like I said, through a forwarding system, so it won't go directly to their residence. So if someone is fearful or needs that additional protection, that is something that is available. And so I know that Erin had mentioned talking about confidentiality, and this next part will really dive into confidentiality. But it is really that is one of the biggest protections that we need to be aware of, because privacy, choice, and informed decision making, those are the foundations of having a positive relationship with our clients. Those are the things that are going to help people react to you in a positive way. They're going to help keep them engaged. They're going to encourage people to ask for help when they need it. They're going to be cooperative and compliant when they have this say in what's going on. And so we know that confidentiality is essential to safety. When it comes to seeking services, that people may be doing so at a great risk. So they are, risking their location. They're risking um, they're really breaking down that isolation that they may have experienced. Um, we know that that's one of the big tactics that abusers will use is isolating somebody from their family and friends. And once they start rebuilding some of those connections and getting to a place where they're more self-sufficient, where they can safety plan on their own and where they can access resources and information, as I mentioned earlier, abusers may be escalating their tactics in order to regain control. And for some survivors, this could be lethal. And so it's always important to remember that confidentiality is one of those puzzle pieces that can be a potential risk and safety risk for people who are seeking your services. And we know that there may be social or personal repercussions for seeking services. That they may have to experience discrimination in housing, in employment. But even without these issues, even without victimization, people have an expectation of privacy and trusting to whom they tell their stories to and who they're disclosing to. And so we really want to, if somebody is telling us about something that has happened to them and they are sharing that information with us, we need to hold that as close as we can, because we want to minimize that risk and develop that rapport with that person. Because we know that maintaining that confidentiality can help build the survivor's ability to trust themselves and to trust everyone else. Because we know that violence breaks trust. And not only a survivor's ability to trust others, but their ability to trust their own judgment, their own wisdom, their own decision making. And so when we are modeling these trusting relationships by keeping information confidential, we can help to rebuild and restore that in someone. And so by working with a victim, it is your responsibility to protect their information that they've shared with you, because, and I sound like a broken record with this, but victims of crime have had their power and control taken away from them. And so we can give that control back in as many ways as possible. And that includes control over how their personal information is used or shared. And so, as a broad definition, when we talk about confidentiality, it's that expectation that providers will respect a survivor's privacy choices so they can seek help and make decisions. And federal grant protections under federal programs like VAWA, grantees are required to protect confidentiality or personally identifying information, that PII. And so when people are seeking help, whether it's through the legal system, through healthcare, through counseling, or housing services, they end up sharing a lot of personal and private information, from, their contact information, health information, employment information, location, all of their income, all of these different things end up being shared. And so personally identifying information, that PII, is exactly how it sounds. Any information that could tell a third party exactly who that person is. So again, it could include information like contact information, phone numbers, addresses, their birth date, ID numbers like Social Security or their student ID or a driver's license number. their place of employment, gender identity, photographs, benefit amounts, income. So all of these different things are things that you have access to in one way or another. And we also know that Delaware is small. And so in smaller communities, of which there are many across the state, there might be different information that could identify someone a lot easier than others. Even if you're not providing a name or address, things like the number of children a survivor has, their religion or faith, or certain facts about their case could identify someone, even if you don't say their name. I'm sure that we have all been in spaces where we've accidentally run into somebody that we know, where it is uncomfortable, or maybe we know more than we should and they don't know. And so it is so important that we protect that information, especially in a small community like ours. And so when we talk about these protections under these grants like VAWA, our personal identifying information is protected, but also things like our individual case information, like Erin was talking about with the emergency transfers. If somebody has requested that and what they've requested, that is protected information, as well as the services that have been requested, utilized, or denied. HUD expects housing counseling agencies to take confidentiality very seriously. So, an agency must hold all client information in strict confidence in a secure location. And there are penalties under the Fair Credit Reporting Act, as well as violations under VAWA or fair housing that could come into play. And disclosure of information that could be contained in credit reports, because we know that that can be a component of people seeking housing. The disclosure of that information can be made to clients depending on the terms of the contract between the agency and the reporting credit bureau. And that confidentiality also applies to HUD staff. So if you are having to provide performance review information, if you're having a site visit, if HUD staff is asking for client files, we have to make sure that all of the personally identifying information is redacted from those files. So, it's so important that we are keeping things like certifications and documentations away from places where people can't readily access that information. But all of that information we can share, demographics, we can share number of clients served, but when it gets into the weeds of who this person is and what is their whole story and what is their whole background, those are the things that we need to keep confidential. But there are times that we know the victim or survivor wants you to share or needs you to share that information. And so anytime that happens, we want to make sure that we are centering the survivor. That is the question that we really want to put to the forefront. Am I centering their needs? Am I supporting their choices and helping them to meet their needs? And so as Erin had mentioned, that there are provisions that help keep victim information safe, and these provisions also allow survivors to make a request that their information is shared as they see fit. And so having written consent to share that information is critical. And so again, when we talk about protections under federal grants like VAWA, we need that written consent to disclose information, but we also need to remember that we cannot withhold services or make a condition that, well, you have to sign this written consent before you get any services from us or until for you to enter this program. So having that blanket consent is not required to receive services. And so written consent must be specific. So we want to make sure that it's for a specific purpose, and that the survivor is identifying what that purpose is. If it's making a referral or arranging for other services or arranging for something like an emergency transfer, that it is for a specific time frame. We don't want this to go into perpetuity. We want to say, like, let's revisit this in 6 months, in 3 months, in a year, whatever that person agrees to, that feels that it's reasonable to limit that information to is acceptable. And make sure that it's informed. And so that means that the person knows where their information is going, what's being done with it, why it's being shared, what are the consequences or benefits of sharing that information, that they are fully aware of what's happening. So what does it look like in practice? A consent for release of information. And so each agency, I know that in all of the agencies that I've worked with over the years, that those consents look a little bit different, but there are key components to all of them. And so one, who will the information be shared with? And so this is a time to be as specific as possible. Which person or agency is permitted to receive the information? It might include community partners, medical professionals, HUD, whoever it is. They can put down even just a specific person. If they say, I want it to be Deidre at Child Inc., and that's the only person, then that's okay. That is their prerogative to do that. Looking at what specific information will be shared. What do they want to have shared? And again, this can and should be as specific as possible. It could include their name, services they've received, how long they've received services from you, what they're looking for, barriers that they've had, anything about their history. Any of that is also useful. How will this information be shared? What method is going to be used? So some people may say, well, you can share it with somebody over the phone, you can do it in writing, you can send it in email. Other people may say, no, I only want, in-person communication or written communication because I want to have a paper trail. So having that method of communication is essential. Looking at why you're sharing this information. How will sharing this information benefit someone? The written release, again, should always be centered on the victim or survivor. So it's important to talk through the benefits and risks of sharing information. So we're not just sharing information because it makes our lives easier. We want to make sure that it is making the lives of our survivor easier, and there is a benefit to that. And finally, a deadline of when that consent expires. And so consent forms should be re-signed and reevaluated if situations change, if needs change. Whenever any kind of information changes, make sure that that is updated. Or if it's been a while and you say, hey, wait a minute, we've been working with the YWCA for quite a while. Let's just revisit this and make sure that we're still okay to share all this information. Um, and all of this being informed also means not just looking at the benefits, but also looking at the possible consequences of disclosure. So is disclosing this information going to create a safety need or a safety risk? Is it going to create more problems? Are there ways that we can meet your needs without having to release confidential information? So really looking through the benefits and the risks. And so how much information actually needs to be revealed? So if a survivor needs to relocate, thinking about how we're reflecting that, how we're sharing that information. And so according to HUD, confidential information will not be entered into a shared database or disclosed to others, except if the disclosure is requested or consented in that time-limited release, if it's required for use in an eviction or termination hearing, or otherwise required by law. Otherwise, we need that full consent from the survivor. So let's say a community partner wants to just follow up on a referral. They gave you the referral, they want to get back, but you don't have a release. Nope. Sometimes they say, well, I already know that they're getting services from you. I just want to get some confirmation, or I just want to see where they are in the process or know who they're talking to. Again, we're not going to do that. We cannot allow anyone administering assistance or employees to have access to that confidential information unless explicitly authorized. So if somebody is making a referral to other services, make sure you get that release. Make sure it's okay for them to share that information. And releases aren't always reciprocal either. So each agency or organization may have their own needs for that release. So just some key things to remember when it comes to confidentiality and releases, that again, each situation might require different information. So the mode of sharing, the amount of information, the type of information can all depend on what that specific need is. And so sometimes it may be as simple as sharing a phone number, but other cases might require more extensive information. And be prepared, again, to explain the what, how, and why of the release process in simple terms. So we know that, going through systems can be very confusing. We've got our acronyms, we've got our jargon, we've got our codes. So all of that complicates processes as well. But then when we add victimization and trauma on top of that, and how our bodies and our brains and our memory and our processing is affected, and how we take in and retain information, we want to try to make that process as clear and simple as possible. A reminder that written consent is not required to receive services. Somebody can receive services from you and you never have to share that information with anybody. And the most important point is that clients can always opt out of sharing information. So they may change their mind, their needs could change, or their safety plan could change too. So we need to respect the needs and requests of people as their situations change. So some best practices: always work within the boundaries of these confidentiality and disclosure rules. Know that different partners may have different policies, and make sure that the survivor is aware of that, because they may assume that you can just share information with whoever. And if that's what they want, great, but make sure that that is documented somewhere. Again, releases are not the mutual exchange, so making sure everybody has that information is all on the same page. And we want to respect each other's policies and procedures. And while we can't share specific client information, it's okay to discuss hypotheticals and trends. So for example, during some of you may attend the domestic violence task force meetings. And every month during those meetings, we have a section for trends in the field. And so this isn't the time where I would say, well, Susie Smith went to Georgetown Police Department and had all these issues. But I could say, hey, I've noticed a pattern that downstate we have Spanish speaking victims running into some barriers when they're working with law enforcement. So looking at more general trends in the field rather than case specific examples, unless that person has given you the consent to share that. That's how we want to share. So we want to look more broadly when we're talking about problem solving, because that is really a key part of what we do, is problem solving, not only with clients, but with each other as well. All right, any questions have come up? I don't see any. No? All right, we're getting into the home stretch here. So for the rest of our session, we're going to talk about some safety planning strategies and resources. So what can we do? How can we help people feel safer? And we're going to focus on two main elements: looking at building capacity through building safety and support, and connecting folks to resources. So I'd like you to go to the chat and let me know, what does being safe at home mean to you? Kind of sounds like a pageant question. But think about, what does being safe at home mean to you? What does it look like? How does it feel? So you can put that in the chat, or if you prefer to unmute and say it out loud, you can do that as well. So we have a couple folks saying being able to relax without worry, being at peace.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi, Miss Courtney. My name is
Huh,
Francis Thomas. I'm at the YWCA at the front desk.
wonderful.
My question to you is, um, I haven't known Section 8 to give out the resources that you're talking about in the packet on letting someone know if they're in a domestic violent relationship. What can they do about it?
Okay.
Do you know, say like HUD's packet or Section 8's packet, because HUD and Section 8 is two different programs, but they
Hmm.
under HUD. I'm just curious because I have seen a packet, but I never seen this information that you're giving out. And it just made me curious of how could we get some of this information out to constituents.
That
A
is a
lot
good.
of women, when they're in a violence, domestic violence situation, they
Mhm.
won't speak out.
Right. Right. Yeah, it's hard. It's a huge, it's a huge weight on people to feel like they have to disclose or share that information, or sometimes they may not even recognize it as um as violence going on as well. And
And
so, yeah, go ahead.
and also they may not know this type of help about the
Right.
emergency transfer, the internal, external.
Mhm.
I'm just finding out this. This is news to me also.
Well, I'm glad you're here to get this information. And so
Yes.
yeah, so we have a bunch of resources that we'd be happy to share with you that you can, put out at the front desk. We'll have some things that you'll be able to print out as well. But I think that there are likely opportunities internally as well where you can talk about, what other information do people need and what could be most helpful to them.
And one more question,
Sure.
Courtney. Does this course have where you can take a test at the end to receive a certificate?
There's no test, but you'll get a certificate.
Okay, I am registered, Courtney.
Okay, there you go.
Okay,
Yes,
thank
so we'll
you.
make
I'm
sure you
gonna
get a
put it back
certificate.
on mute because I'm at the front desk.
All right. Thank you so much for sharing those things. And that is really great to hear. Um, because people do need this information, and unfortunately it is not as accessible to people as we would like it to be. So all of the information that we give out today and any of the resources and things like that that we provide, please feel free to take that information and spread it far and wide, because um, it is all very critical. And as I mentioned, if you're looking for domestic violence specific information, I'll make sure that my contact information is on the last slide. But we have resource cards and things like that that we can get to you if you have, a front desk or a waiting area, or if you just want to have them in stock to give out to people. I'd be happy to facilitate getting you all resources as well.
Thank you so very much, Courtney.
You're welcome. Thank you. And
I
then,
just
well,
want to also too just
yeah, go ahead.
thank you, Miss Francis, for letting us know that, because that just made a little light bulb go off in my brain that maybe that's some coordination and some engagement that the COC needs to do with our housing jurisdictions that are the ones administering Section 8, to maybe help them incorporate some of that information into their policy so that there's an easy streamline from our programs to theirs when possible. Even if people aren't being served through our programs, just to make sure that those resources are out. So thank you for letting us know. And if you wanna either follow up with me afterwards or put in the chat which jurisdiction, so like if it's like Newcastle County or DSHA or City of Wilmington, that you don't see those materials in their information that they give out, I can get a little jump start on that.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Erin, for that as well. Because yeah, that's why we're doing this training, to make sure that people have what they need. And so if there is something that you need as a provider, or that the people that you serve could benefit from, we want to make sure that we get that information into the people's hands. Um, And so while we were talking about all that, we had lots of comments in the chat about feeling safe at home, and I see a lot of common themes of having peace, feeling comfortable, um, being free of danger and harassment, being free to communicate, not getting a knot in your stomach when you go home. You can forget about the outside world and do your hobbies, being able to let your guard down, feeling at ease. So yeah, so being calm, being familiar where you're in control of yourself, all of these are great because home is our safe haven. Home should be where we can go and let our guard down. And unfortunately, we know that beyond and despite all of the protections that it exists, the safety strategies that exist, many survivors still don't have that luxury of truly feeling safe at home, where they can put their feet up, where they can comfortably let their guard down, where they can, if they forget to lock their door when they come right into to their home, that they don't have to worry that somebody is going to break in. They don't have to worry about answering their phone and having somebody on the other end who's harming them in some way. So it's those kinds of things that really make a home for us. And so just to recap some of those barriers for survivors, those barriers to safety, we know that people may be leaving their current housing situation to escape domestic violence. And so if their abuser leaves, they may be the breadwinner, they may be the one who's supporting them. And so they may not be able to afford to stay where they are. In some cases, they may be evicted because of the abuser's behavior, where they're creating an unsafe or unhealthy environment for the victim or for other residents. We also know that someone who has domestic violence in their history can interfere with somebody's ability to access housing, especially if that information hasn't been kept confidential as it should. We also know that abusers may have contributed to someone's poor rental histories or created safety, security, or economic concerns. And we also know that oftentimes a victim's economic stability has been sabotaged, their ability to make it on their own because their abuser has ruined their credit, has withheld money or resources, has led them to having trouble paying a deposit or rent or utilities, or kept them from all those systems so they have no idea where to start or what to do. They don't have the knowledge to engage with those. And so we want to make sure that, again, people are aware of their rights, they're aware of the services, they're aware of the protections that they have access to. And so when when a survivor discloses to anyone, whether we may be expecting it or not, it is tough stuff. And it can be difficult for both the survivor and the person who's hearing the disclosure. So you may not know what to do or how to handle it. And it may be brand new to you. And so I always like to tell people to imagine that person who's talking to you, who's disclosing to you, is someone who's close to you. How would you want someone to react? If the person disclosing was your best friend or, or your sibling or whoever that is close to you, how would you want somebody to react to them? How would you want somebody to react to you if that was you? And so it doesn't take, it's not a huge, scientific equation. It's not a huge formula to put things together. It's all about being human. It's all about being empathetic, sympathetic, and present. Be present and be in the moment with them. Because it does take a lot of courage for someone to share such difficult information. So really be there with them. Take the time to listen. Don't be like absentmindedly looking at your email or your phone or looking over your shoulder to see what else is going on. Really be in that moment with them. Allow the person to vent or validate their concerns. They may not know what to do. They may just come to you with this huge information dump. They may be dumping a lot of emotion, a lot of overwhelm. And so they may not know what's going on or be afraid of what's going to happen next. So listen to them and ask what they need and ask what they want. Yeah, applying active listening skills, absolutely. Really showing somebody that you're listening, that you're there with them. And it's important to establish that rapport and foster trust with the person. So if you say you're going to follow up, you're going to find out information for them, follow through on the things you say you're going to do. And if that person who is causing harm is present with the survivor while you're talking to them, do not have decision making or safety related concerns with them. So
Go
we
ahead,
want to
baby.
make sure. Oh, does somebody have a question? No? Okay. Make sure that we are saving those. So if we want to have those conversations with somebody, we try to do that when they're alone. And check in later with them if you can. If they have talked to you, they've disclosed to you, and you have the opportunity to revisit that with them, check in, even just letting them know that you're a safe person and you want to help. That is really helpful. And ultimately, we should be modeling appropriate respect, honesty, empathy, and afford individuals their dignity in every interaction that we give to them. They're already dealing with so much that we want to make sure that we are seeing them as a person first. And I know that I've said this a bunch of times too, but remember, the survivor is driving this bus. We want to make sure that they are the ones who are ultimately making the decisions about how they're disclosing, how they're sharing information, what is safe for them. We're giving them back that control. And as a service provider, it's important to understand where your participants are coming from and what they need to get the level of protection and services that they need. So really look at what their goals and experiences are. And it also involves recognizing and identifying when housing protections might be available to participants. And so we talked about how it's important to be proactive and share those resources and protections, at intake, and letting people know, don't wait until there's a problem. Get those out there to people so that way they might have that in the back of their mind if it comes up. And so we want to provide that education, provide any assistance and support that people have if they're looking to employ some of those protections or to make an emergency transfer. If you have to advocate with other housing partners or other community partners, that's essential as well. And identify any appropriate resources, because you're not expected to know everything. And so we want to get people into the hands of others who know what they're talking about. And so finally, we are going to wrap up today looking at connecting to resources. And again, with all of this information, you may feel very overwhelmed. So we often communicate our support to victims and survivors by letting them know you are not alone. We may repeat that over and over again. I'm here for you. I'm here to help you. But you know what? We need to go for that to you for that as well. Those kinds of things apply to you as a provider. Nobody is expecting you to carry this burden and weight that comes along with the work that you do. And so I really just want you to know that there are services and supports out there for you as well. So we know that Delaware has several 24-hour hotlines that assist victims and survivors of domestic violence. And through these hotlines, people can be connected to emergency domestic violence shelters, counseling, safety planning resources, and more. And the hotlines are also available for people like you who are working with people who are affected by domestic violence. Maybe you want to look at, maybe you're at a loss for what resources are out there. Maybe you want to know what could happen next. You want to run through some of those hypotheticals or trends. The advocates on the hotline are amazing, and they do such fantastic work. Deidre and Stu, I don't want to put you on the spot, but is there anything that you would like to talk about in terms of what people should know about your resources.
Hi, everybody. I sound horrendous. I'm fighting allergies, so I won't speak long, and I'm going to just speak to a little bit about our rapid rehousing program, and then Sue and Trudy will kind of jump in. I'll first talk to our hotline. Thank you for the shout out, Courtney, about the services we provide, and as Courtney talked about a little bit earlier. We are absolutely a resource for you if you have questions and concerns about services that are available for survivors, or trying to get some ideas about the best approach to a situation. You certainly can give the hotline and call me directly. It's fine. Along with our hotline, of course, we're connected to emergency shelter, and so sometimes that may be the situation where you are working with someone who you've successfully housed, and for whatever reason, that housing now becomes unsafe. There are a lot of other details to work out related to them keeping that housing and working with an agency. But in the meantime, what does this family do? And so coming to shelter might be something that they may need to consider. And so that may be a possibility. So we encourage you to, for you to call it and to have survivors to call. Our rapid rehousing program is unique in the way that we specifically only work with survivors of domestic violence. And I offered to Erin and Courtney for our case managers. Deborah Fletcher is the program coordinator, but she is not on this Zoom today. But they specifically only work with survivors of domestic violence. Our referrals come from sometimes in shelter and other agencies that are working with survivors. And so I thought it might be helpful for Sue and Trudy to share some of the experiences that we have, or things to keep in mind when working with survivors, because that's all the work that we do. It looks a little different when you are working with folks who aren't struggling with safety issues, or struggling with being housed for the first time after being independently, after being in a relationship for a while. So I hope what they share is helpful. I do have to pop off because I have something else going on. So Trudy and Sue, if you would take the stage and just share a little bit about our program and some of the things we keep in mind when we're working with our clients. And thank you, Courtney and Erin, for having us.
Thank you so much.
I don't know if you mind, Trudy, if I jump in first, but feel free to chime in because of your wealth of experience with the program. So as Deirdre mentioned, our referrals come from professionals in the domestic violence service area and from the shelter. We serve those that are immediately fleeing domestic violence and have become homeless because of that. And we do a thorough intake, and we do have a wait list, assuming that's very similar to other rapid rehousing programs in the area. We talk about safety from the get-go, from the intake to after people are placed, and meet with them after they're placed at least monthly, and that is their safety plan is first on the list of things that we discuss. We, of course, that everyone that comes to us is as different as I am from all of you. They may have experience renting, they may not, they may have had experience in homes. So we just start from scratch and compile a lot of resources on the benefits of our programs and arm them and explain to them what the program is so that they can go out there and team with us. We both search, not just them, not just us, because they know the neighborhood they want to live in. They know what they're looking for. It doesn't serve anybody if we're looking for one thing and it's not what they want. They know and gain experience looking for housing. We educate them on the program. If they don't have experience, we educate them about being good renters, what that means, what is the responsibility of the tenant versus what's the responsibility of the landlord, and go over every detail of the lease. We talk about rental scams, when they're searching, so that they don't fall prey to anything untoward or anything that would take away from the very very needed finances that they have. Trudy, you want to jump in on anything? So it's very much a partnership, and we guide them through things from even the questions they ask the landlord. I like to emphasize, from a background in HR, pretend you're applying for a job. This is a very tight market, and the landlords that we work with, mostly private landlords. Sell yourself as someone that they can trust, that's going to take good care of their property and is a very responsible person. Be a person of your word, and not implying that they aren't, but we don't always look at ourselves as that kind of applicant when we're looking at housing. But it's so tight that anything that you can do to make a good impression, do it. Be there on time, have your pay stubs ready. Just be ready to make a great impression and tell them how much it means to you to have an opportunity to live there. Are all going to speak in your favor when the legions of people walk through after you.
So I have a question that's a slightly off topic, but I think might be helpful. I wonder if you have any advice for providers that might suspect that somebody is experiencing domestic violence, and that it might be putting their housing at risk, or that they might end up needing an emergency transfer, but they haven't actually notified them yet, or they haven't said anything to them yet for them to kind of actively start the actual safety planning and emergency transfer process. Would you have any advice on how they would safely engage or try to make that participant feel safe enough to disclose, and work on getting them into a safer environment?
I'm not sure that the fears about domestic violence, maybe it's just that the landlords haven't expressed that, but usually they know that we come under the umbrella of domestic violence. I won't say Mary had a domestic violence experience, because that's Mary's business, but more than 9 out of 10 become empathetic rather, because they want to help that person. There's always, every once in a while, the person that says, oh, no, don't bring that here. They're concerned about violence or trouble or loudness or fighting. I don't know if their worries go down the line to moving them at that point. But then what I've done, and maybe this answers that a little bit, is talk about all the things that we do to educate our clients / their tenants about keeping their address confidential and the programs available to them, social media, just word of mouth, how to really look at this new chapter is what they're seeking and a new start, to be very, very confidential about that and very careful. When the few times that someone has had an abuser follow them, we've been very fortunate that the landlord was able to, I think one time the transfer was needed because the hot water wasn't working, but a couple of other times over the history, it was because of an abuser. And the landlord was willing to work with us to move them to a different unit within, the property that they own. We're very, very fortunate in the relationships that we build with our landlords, and I think that's a huge part of it before an issue comes up. I don't know if that answers your question directly. And just being able to work it out with them and saying, we want to come to some kind of solution that's going to work for the client, but also for them, because we want to continue our relationships with our landlords.
So Erin, if I understood your question, part of it anyway, was being able to give other providers some advice in that if they feel or they suspect that there is domestic violence going on with that particular client, what would be a good approach
Yeah,
to
so like
address it with
maybe
that
if,
in mind? Is that what we're asking?
yeah,
It's
like
okay.
maybe if they are like maybe there's been a couple police calls or there's been a couple noise complaints, somebody's exhibiting like the behavior that they are like experiencing violence and trauma, but they haven't expressly come to like for like a normal provider that's not specifically a DV provider, and they haven't disclosed or like it indicated that they want to like begin that process or have any type of safety planning. Like how would like a normal provider potentially approach that if they're afraid for that person's safety, or if they suspect that stuff is going on?
By
Well,
provider, I'm sorry, Deirdre.
It's okay. So and I guess when she says provider, she's talking about the other folks that are in the Zoom right now that are providing those housing services. I think that much earlier, Courtney, spoke about kind of survivors themselves recognizing that this is the situation and they are unsafe, or this is the experience. And oftentimes that it's difficult for them to recognize that these behaviors or these things have happened, can escalate, can potentially be fatal, can be dangerous. This is how it's affecting your children, so forth and so on. So I think that having a conversation, a direct conversation with your client about what your concerns are important. Certainly not in a way that you are being not unsympathetic to their experience as a survivor, but you are talking about your concern about their safety. And yes, the ultimate impact that these behaviors could have as they are in this unit what could be the end result? Yes, in fact, if the police get called one more time, do you understand that your landlord has such upset that you could lose this unit? You could jeopardize X, Y, and Z. So I think having that direct conversation with the addition to saying, and these are some other services that are available. It's great for us to recognize the problem and all of that. But sometimes where we lack is being able to provide what services that they need. Is it that they need to call the hotline? Is it serious enough that they need to go to shelter? Is it whatever it is, that we are also offering that. Often, what happens is that sometimes, survivors develop a view of the violence that they're experiencing, and they minimize it. And that's kind of how they survive in the abuse. So often hearing from another person from the outside say, I see your black eye. I see your car with all 4 tires slashed. I see that every time that you separate from your kids, they're clinging onto your legs, giving some very clear examples of what you see. and then asking, what do you think about that? What do you, is that, am I being accurate with what I'm seeing? And now, got it. How can I help? Because ultimately, the survivor themselves have to make the decision whether or not action is going to follow. Us as providers, we can say it all day and all night, but until that survivor makes that decision to make that movement, that's when, something will happen. And there are situations where a decision isn't made, and they stay in that spot. And that can be frustrating. But I think, as providers and the helpers, we are understanding that that's just where people are sometimes. And sometimes we have to be uncomfortable in their comfortable place. And then be available when they ask for help. So that would be, my advice. And of course, calling your resources and finding out, Deidre, tell me, what else can I say? What else can I do? I may be able to help you with some things, but I also may say, you've done it all. And that's all that we can do.
A follow-up to that, would you have any thoughts or maybe some do's and don'ts on how to approach a conversation like that wouldn't potentially put that survivor in more danger? Like if their social media or their phone records or whatever level of control that the potential abuser is placing on that survivor, and you're suspecting that and you're wanting to kind of have that conversation, how would you approach that without putting them at more risk?
Well, I think well, first, I think that we have to be mindful that those type of conversations that we're not having it with the partner there. Sometimes, they might, say, oh no, it's fine, but really that their positioning in that relationship and in that conversation is to control, is to dominate. So creating a space where they can have an open conversation, a confidential conversation to talk to you, and feeling safe in that way, is important. I think the other piece to that flip side is that it's important that we as providers also listen to our guts and our red flags around whether a situation is not safe for us. When a client may say, oh, it's fine, it's not a problem, but your gut is telling you that you don't feel comfortable and you feel nervous, and you have seen the holes in the wall, and you've been with her after she got out of the ER for being assaulted, so you don't feel safe. So that's important for you to pay attention to that as well, that you absolutely can put things in place. So maybe, I'm not going to come visit you at home, but can I come and can we meet at your child's school? That does a couple of things. Going to the child's school may be a safe place for her because the partner's not worried about her going to the kid's school, right? And that the partner's not going to follow there. So that might be the safe place. So kind of creating that safe space for you, and for them. I also would say it is natural, I think. I think that if we're all being responsible providers, that we are closely allowing our clients to consider and think about their decisions. And as we teach our kids, with decisions, there are consequences often. And sometimes talking to our clients about understanding that, and how that works. But at the same time, being careful in that conversation so that now we're not blaming. There's a difference between realistic looking at, behaviors and consequences, but also blaming. So that delivery of, well, if you hadn't, as opposed to, what do you think about that decision? Two different deliveries, sounds very different and can be received very differently. So I think, that is, I think those two things are key. You talked about social media and phones and all of, you're at risk. And so, as a part of safety planning, talking to your survivor about perhaps another person, a partner having access to those things. And is it that you just need to stay off social media for a minute, right? That Facebook post isn't that important. Or when you are using your phone, is this a phone that your partner may have access to? So let's just cut this off and let me look into getting you another phone. Let me just shut it off. And can we get you another phone? So that you can feel like you can freely, talk. Is your email being read? If that's the case, do we need to set up a new email address for you? So just kind of putting, helping them think those things through, and putting those things in place. We're in the age of cars being tracked, and, do you need to, how does he find me wherever I go? Well, you have a tracker on your car, and they have access to that. So do we need to, take that car to a shop to get it sweeped to see if in fact the tracker is there? So talking about those things. The other piece of that is, while we're getting them to look at their safety and taking measures for safety, often those things cost money. Our clients already don't have a lot of money. So as we are offering these resources, making sure that we have an understanding of what is available for them. For example, if we say, let's get rid of this phone, how is that survivor going to get another phone? Do you have phones in your program that you can offer? Where can they get that? Where can we cut that off and hand another one? And so, if they're talking about getting locks changed, do you provide money for that to happen in your grant, that you are providing for them? Or are they connected with, the advocacy program, one of the places that help with lock change? So having your resources readily available when you put safety plans in place is important, because without that, we're actually making them putting them in more jeopardy by not giving them the resources they need to be safe.
Thanks, Deidre. Trudy, you had your hand up. Did you want to go ahead?
Those were all fantastic points with Deidre and Sue. Just want to thank you guys for going into more depth on that. So I just wanted to, kind of chime in as well, just with my experience with survivors, on just some of the things that I've learned, working in the field, and how I feel like we're constantly learning. There's so many different things that we take into consideration when addressing our clients and ways to help them and what ways we can best support. So, trainings like this and other opportunities to learn more about putting the survivor center focus, really letting them drive the bus, as you said, Courtney, and just helping them to, realize that they are in control of the situation. So sometimes as case managers, we think that it's our job to come in and tell them everything that they should do better, or things that they can assess to make their life a little bit easier. But of course, they are the expert at their trauma. They're the expert of their DV. So just learning that, those experiences, make them who they are, realizing that, we can advise, we can suggest, we can, offer an open space for feedback. But I think the most important thing is just asking for input, hearing how they feel about it, making sure that we are not just putting all of our thoughts and, suggestions and influences on them, but not hearing the survivor as to, okay, you told me is this what I heard? What I've heard is that, you haven't been sleeping, your daughter hasn't been eating, can you tell me a little bit about what influences that and kind of working around, or really having that open conversation, because there is a big difference with a client that feels heard and a client that feels, like they have to be on the defense because, the conversation starts off with, all right, why didn't you pay your rent? That's a total different conversation. So instead of, just asking very direct questions, just saying, okay, well, can you tell me a little bit about what's going on with your rental payments? So I think it's very much in your approach, very much in very much in the way that you hear your client, because of course, they know themselves better than we know them. But it's also, as you've been working with them over time, you'll get to see their patterns, their behaviors, and what attributes to the way that they deal with their stressors and triggers. So really focusing on the trauma informed approach is just, to really be mindful of what we do, but also be welcoming to, opening that space for them to share, open that space to feel heard, because there are many influences that, as I'm learning, even more, that it's not just, sometimes we just think it's one thing, like we look at it in a very focused lens, like, okay, this person is just an angry person. This person is just someone that we just don't get along, or they could be, there could be several different layers to that individual. So I think when it comes to the do's and don'ts of evaluating, I guess, if someone is going through a domestic violence situation, like Deidre was saying, just asking those questions and just having a very honest conversation with them, but doing it very cautiously. And, just emphasizing that, we are on the same team. We have the same objective. I'm not here to tell you something that you already do not know. I'm sure, you made it this far and you survived a lot of difficult things on your own. So it is not my job to tell you how you can do things better, but it is my job to make sure you're safe and to make sure that you have the things in place to make sure that you and your family can thrive and, move forward. Because on one aspect of it, having those those 4 layers of housing, food, those important aspects there help the situation. But there's also another layer to it that sometimes we have to outsource and see what other resources are available, because we try to put everything on our backs. And it can get a little challenging. So even in times where there is a housing shortage and there's not that much funding, so many people are in crisis, and it's like you want to do everything that you can to ensure that you're supporting the person and helping them to see sometimes the red flags that you feel that they don't see. So I think, just always working in their best interest, but not judging, not thinking, okay, well, this person has went back to their abuser several times. They must not know what they're doing, or they must not see it as an issue. Everyone has different responses, in trauma. So yeah, just working with our clients, I think that we've been able to realize is that, you know, we just are here to support and to provide that help that you guys need, because we want to see you successful and stable. We want to see you, the goal of our program is, of course, housing stability, but to ensure the total, the total overall success of the family. So of course, the kids, seeing them happy, healthy, thriving. So those are just some of the aspects that I think are important, working with the person, not just the trauma.
Thank you, Trudy. And I think that is such a great way. We're right on time for ending. And I think that's such a great way to end our session. So thank you, Trudy and Deidre and Sue, for sharing those perspectives of a provider, because I think that, like everything that we've said today, that there are so many different protections out there for people. There are structures that are put in place, but until that person wants to engage in those supports and those services, that we're not going to get anywhere. And so I've seen in the chat using a strength focused approach and a solution focused approach, helping people figure out and remember that they are the experts and we need to trust their instincts, even if they're not the same as ours. So with that, I'd like to respect everybody's time and we're going to wrap up here. We will share out references and resources for folks. We'll share out the slides from today. We'll get all of those out to you within the next few days. But I really appreciate all of your time. And thank you so much and have a great day. And thank
Miss
you.
Courtney?
Yes.
Okay, this is Francis again.
Hi.
I just like to say I'm at the Y, but I'm through a program at the Goodwill called the CSEP program for people that are 55 and older. But I wanted to thank you and all of the rest of the ladies because this is some pertinent, important information that you have given me and I can take with me
Wonderful. I'm so glad it's
into
been
my
helpful.
community. Thank you so very much, ladies.
You are so welcome. Thank you. And so with that, again, thank you everyone for being here and we will see you soon. Thank you so much.
All right.